Also at the Methuen Catholicism Conference, Callie Hammond explored the way in which Roman law about marriage served to stabilise the inheritance of property through ensuring legitimate children and thus stabilising society. And that is very similar, I think, to what we observe in the codes of the Old Testament. For Augustine, she pointed out, affection, procreation and sacrament were the purposes of marriage. Marriage served to stabilise society, although, as she points out, this is not what most people think they're doing when they're getting married, and it certainly wasn't in Augustine's day either. For the couple, it was, for Augustine, ideally the sexual expression of friendship. Callie point, and again I think that's a really helpful way of thinking about what marriage might be, which is clearly not simply related to the gender of those people who are engaging in the sexual expression of friendship. Callie pointed out that it's a long jump from Augustine's affection, procreation and sacrament to the modern thinking about marriage, which is increasingly about stable, faithful and loving relationships. And she suggested or argued that the two paradigms are so far apart that we have to make a case for how we get from one to the other. That's a way of saying, I think, that it's quite difficult sometimes in this debate to see how the institution that we're talking about is the same, or whether it's the same as the institution we were talking about in the early church or in the Reformation. What we think marriage is, what Augustine thought marriage was, yes, it was about one man and one woman, but it was also about one man and one woman in a particular social context, a particular cultural context. Our social and cultural context has shifted, our legal context has shifted, and that changes, I think, what we think of the priorities of marriage. It's worth noting that the legal aspect of marriage long remained a civic or a civil affair. As late as the 10th century, or even after the 10th century, marriages were not primarily conducted in church. There might be a Christian ceremony, but it was conducted outside the church doors. You recognise that the marriage relationship was something that sat uneasily between the church and the world. It wasn't until the 13th century in the Western Church that a priest was held to preside over the ceremony, and thus, in some senses, to use an anachronistic term from the Reformation in England, to solemnise matrimony. But it was still recognised, and in the theology of sacrament, for those who think that marriage is a sacrament, it is still recognised that the sacrament is made by the couple in their relationship to God. The priest does not enact the sacrament in any way. Couples right up to the Reformation in Western Europe could still marry through mutual agreement without the involvement of a priest, and the church would recognise those marriages. And a lot of what's going on in the Reformation is an attempt to stop what is seen as secret marriage. These sorts of marriages are often known as secret marriages, and to make marriage be something public, and make marriage be something done in front of the congregation, with a congregation present. And you see that we have a historical remnant of that in the calling of banns. Marriage is the declaration of the intention to marry is a public event, and people are to be asked if this is what they want to do. And people are to be asked if there's any problems about this. That's partly about trying to find out if this person's married somebody else beforehand. To go back to the early church, though, we do see the early church definitely starting to develop a theology of marriage, often based on the exegesis of Ephesians 5:32. And this is an important text, because this is where the idea of marriage as sacrament comes from. That word in verse 32 that is translated mystery in this translation, in the Vulgate is sacramental. In the Greek it's mysterion, and that is translated then as sacramentum in the Latin, and feeds into the idea that marriage is a sacrament. It's actually the only use of the term sacramentum in the entire New Testament Vulgate. Ephesians 5, as we can see here, presents marriage as a model for the relationship between the church and God, or the relationship between church and Christ. And that combined with the fact that marriage is clearly a very important social and societal institution, means that Christians are starting to think about how do we talk about marriage theologically. Christian understanding has developed to see it as an expression of God's love, to see it as the context in which sexuality was properly lived out, the context in which procreation therefore should properly take place, and in which children should be reared and nurtured. However, and we might say perhaps despite Augustine's best efforts, because Augustine really did think that procreation was really important for marriage, because he thought that marriage was about producing the right number of the elect, so that heaven would, when it came to the end of time, heaven would be filled with the right number of people. Procreation and children have never actually been seen as essential to marriage. There's never been a suggestion, for instance, that women beyond childbearing age should not marry. And even before the introduction of such clerical celibacy, there were quite strong moves to say that married priests should not have children, which is sort of a way in the early world of saying actually married priests should not be indulging in sexual intercourse, since without contraception there's a few other ways of ensuring you didn't have children. There's a whole discussion around celibate marriage in the early church, an ongoing discussion which goes on right into the 7th or the 8th centuries, which indicates a real ambiguity about attitudes towards sex. And we can see that picked up, and I'm going to come back to that, in the Middle Ages around discussions about celibacy and the praise of asceticism. Important to see also is that Christians in this period increasingly emphasise the need for both partners to consent freely to the marriage, although it has to be said that particularly amongst the elite, arranged marriages clearly continued, and we have all sorts of examples of children being contracted to marriage, for marriage at the age of 2 or 3, particularly amongst leading. Particularly amongst leading families. Two other things shifted in the medieval period. Marriage came to be defined as insoluble except by death, particularly in the Western Church, based on readings of Matthew 5 and Matthew 19. It came to be seen as restricted by questions of consanguinity, so who are you related to by blood? And I think we can see good reasons for that. We know that inbreeding is a bad idea. Geneticists have proved that to us. And that, I think, is a recognition of that. But also marriage restrictions by affinity, that is, who are your in-laws? So you're not supposed to marry your brother-in-law's sister, for instance, or your sister-in-law's brother. And in the church, restrictions by spiritual affinity. That means that you can't marry the child of your godfather or the child of your godmother. So there's no actual relationship there at all for either of those second ones. This is about saying these people are too closely related. This is partly about making sure that marriage is trying to be outside the particular circle. It has to be said that these rules became a real money spinner for the church in the later Middle Ages. All of us here, I'm sure, are aware of the fact that Henry VIII is one of the wonderful examples of this. When he married Catherine of Aragon, he was actually marrying somebody to whom he was not allowed to get married by these rules, because Catherine of Aragon had already been married to his elder brother. Whether consummated or not remains a huge question, but the fact is that Henry VIII had to pay a lot of money to be allowed to marry Catherine of Aragon, and then when he didn't want to marry her sometime later, the Pope refused to undispense the dispensation of the But it wasn't just Henry VIII. The church was, in the late medieval period, was raising a lot of money particularly around spiritual affinity laws. And I think we can see here that you can see here the way in which these things shift. Consanguinity, we would still say, actually, marrying your first cousin is probably not a great idea. It's not illegal, it's probably genetically not a great idea. You certainly want to check out a few things before you do it. In-laws marriage, now much less of an issue. Not marrying the child of your godfather, I don't think any of us would have a problem with that, unless the godfather happens to be legal. Marriage was then was shifting and changing. The church was starting to control it, trying to control it, and in 1215, when the definitive list of 7 sacraments is articulated by the Fourth Lateran Council, marriage was included on that list. It's been on and off the list of sacraments through the medieval period, and when we get to the Protestant Reformation, it will come off the list again for Protestants, but it gets definitely on there in 1215. Which means really that we've got, most people only have access to 6 sacraments at any given time. The women certainly only have access to 6, only the fact that women in this period can't really pray. All this discussion of the Middle Ages, though, needs to be put in the context of the fact that marriage is not the only form of life recognised for Christians, and indeed it is seen in many ways in late antiquity and in the medieval period as an inferior form of life. Paul's letters, and particularly 1 Corinthians 7, witness to a real ambiguity in the assessment of marriage. Was it not wiser to remain celibate? The tension between the valuing of marriage and the valuing of celibacy was heightened from the 4th century by the popularity of asceticism. And it forms the background to a lot of the writing about Christian marriage, as I said, in late antiquity and the medieval period. Augustine did believe that marriage would have existed in paradise. Not all theologians did, but he thought that in paradise, sexual intercourse would have been a rational process governed and controlled by reason. And for Augustine, the lack of control in sex, which came about with the fall, was the means by which sin had been transmitted. That becomes very important in the Western Church. Marriage is seen as necessary for the fallen world, and it is seen as the proper place for sexual intercourse for those who can't control themselves, but it is also the means of passing on original sin. We can see this in lots of writings, but let me just give you one example. Jerome, writing to the young virgin Eustochium, about the drawbacks of marriage, such as pregnancy, the crying of infants, the torture caused by a rival, very realistic Jerome always, the cares of household management, and all those fancy blessings which death at last comes. Virginity, as he thought, as Paul had before him, was much to be preferred. And it has to be said that actually for a good number of women in the early church who didn't, or right through into the modern period, who didn't particularly want to die in childbirth, virginity could also seem quite attractive, I think, for that reason. The perception that marriage was second best, and in particular that sex was inherently sinful, coloured the church's attitudes towards marriage throughout the medieval period. This may have been difficult for both men and women, but it tends to have been women who wrote about it. Bridget of Sweden, for instance, and her husband Ulf Gudmarsson were an upper-class couple who both felt called to follow Christ, but who were both expected by their families to get married and to have children in order to safeguard the dynastic inheritance. So you have a couple here who believe very strongly that their true vocation as Christians is to celibacy, but they have 8 children. They try to live a celibate life when they can, but they do have 8 children. And you get another one, Marjorie of Kemp. If you've ever read Marjorie of Kemp, she has this real pull. She actually really likes sex, and she keeps saying in her book, I just really enjoy my husband, which is wonderful. But actually, I know, Jesus, you're calling me to be celibate. She has 13 children. And in the end, though, she is given permission to live as a virgin, and then she puts on a white robe and she goes off and goes around and becomes a pilgrim, really. But she's very sad about losing not just her relationship to her husband, but her sexual relationship to her her husband. The point I'm wanting to make is that marriage in the medieval period was seen as inferior, and men and women who wanted to follow Christ needed to think about how they lived their lives in order to allow them to do that. And there could be very, very conflicting expectations on them. And as I said, I think the prospect of dying in childbirth, which must have been the most common cause of death for adult women until the modern period, was probably also a reason why celibacy proved attractive to Christian women, both in the early church and the medieval period. Quite apart from the fact that the only way you could get an education was usually to join either a monastery or a nunnery, so that's another, if you wanted to be educated, you were going to be celibate, you were not going to be married. Within all of this, the fundamental assumption is that marriage is a relationship of inequality between men and women. Thomas Aquinas' argument for equality, it has, in a wonderful title of an article, was for an unequal relationship between equals. And I think that tension, we'll see that coming out again in Luther. Assumptions about the respective place of men and women in marriage, as expressed in the household codes, were, as I've said, related to Aristotelian or Galenic biological understandings of sexual differentiation. And these persisted well into the early modern or even into the modern period. They assumed that the rational, warm male was opposed to the emotional, cold female. And for Aristotle, and some of you may be really glad to know this, guys, for Aristotle, truly masculine men could be identified by the fact that their intellect had burned the hair off the top of their head. Causing baldness. So you guys with no hair, you're the real men. In procreation, the active principle was contributed by the male, and the female's role was passive. She provided a nurturing body in which the baby could grow. So interesting implications for that for our thinking about how the doctrine of the Trinity is conceived, but that is a very different question. But that biological understanding of procreation underlay definitions of the proper social role for men and women, both within and without marriage. Men were active and engaged in public life, they were speakers, if you like. Women were to be passive, nurturing, with a focus on the private. The Protestant Reformation picks up on these ideas whilst also according marriage a new importance. Luther and the other reformers of Protestantism were particularly critical of the way in which celibacy had been privileged, but privileged in an extremely hypocritical way. A church which required clerical celibacy, but turned a blind eye to the living arrangements of priests, except to fine them when a child was born. And there were really interesting reflections. There's a really interesting reflection by Katharina Schutz-Zell, who was one of the first women in Germany to marry a priest, and she's the only one that we know about who wrote about it, where she reflects on how the diocese has been profiting from breakdowns in celibacy amongst its priests. And that wasn't just in the Diocese of Strasbourg, that's quite clearly the pattern across Western Europe. Luther affirms that the tasks of caring for children should be shared by both parents, and he's quite firm about that, and he's quite rude about people who think that men shouldn't change nappies. But he nonetheless taught that a woman's true vocation lay in marriage, in her companionship with and her obedience to her husband, and in the bearing and bringing up of children. Women who died in childbirth, Luther thought, were truly following Christ. That is their crucifixion. And there's a very moving bit in his treatise on sacraments in 1520, where he's talking about a situation where both the mother and the child are clearly going to die in childbirth. And at what stage can you baptise the baby? Can you baptise the baby when only a foot or a hand is sticking out, is emerged from the womb? And he said, I'm really not sure about this, I don't know what we do, but we just have to do the best pastoral thing we can. That is clearly a situation in which both mother and child are expected to die. This is a common experience at the time. For Luther, then, the obedience of the wife to her husband, the subordination of women to men, were part of the natural order given under the law to which marriage belonged. And Luther is very clear, marriage for him is not a sacrament, it's part of the civic order, but it's part of the civic order that needs to be lived out in a Christian way. The gospel transcended this order, so that in questions of salvation for Luther, men and women stood equal before God. So Luther, very much like Aquinas, equal but equal but unequal. In England, from 1549, the Book of Common Prayer listed 3 causes for which matrimony was ordained. Actually, I've given you a bit more than just the causes here. I think it's worth noticing that the preface thinks that it's an honourable estate ordained by God, and there we have our 3 causes. First, it's ordained for the procreation of children, to be brought up in the fear and nurture of God and to the praise of his holy name, so procreation and bringing up of children. Secondly, it's ordained as a remedy against sin, to avoid fornication. So such people who have not the gift of continency may marry. That's a real resonance still with 1 Corinthians 7. There's still a hint in 1549, well, in the prayer book, that actually if you could get on without marriage, you'd be better off. If you can manage without sex, then if you can be continent, otherwise get married. And keep yourself undefiled members of Christ's body. So there's still a sense here of being defiled by being married. And thirdly, it's ordained for mutual society help and comfort, that the one ought to help the other, both in prosperity and adversity, into which holy estate these 2 persons present come now to be joined, we imagine. Procreation, the managing of lust, and companionship. Those are the 3 aspects which shape early modern understandings of marriage, and they continue to shape our understanding today. But I think it's really important to see these 3 aims of marriage, which we've heard cited quite a lot in the recent debate, in the context of the rest of the BCP. Something we don't look at so often is the advice on the homily. And the advice on the homily is very clear that what we are supposed to be looking at here is marriage lived out in the way that Ephesians 5 and 1 Peter have seen it. So, all you that are married should listen to what Scripture says about how husbands should comport themselves towards their wives, so about loving, about being heirs together of the grace of life. So this is very much picking up on that aspect of respect, mutual honour. And then for wives, the duty of the wife, hear and learn your duties towards your husbands. St. Paul in the aforementioned epistle to the Ephesians teacheth you thus, wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord. St. Peter also doth instruct you very well, thus saying, ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also may be without the word. If any obey not the word, they also may without the word be one who is the conversation of their wives. So you're supposed to be converting your husband to proper Christianity, so that's what Paul's thinking, but very much the message of subordination. It worries me slightly when I see apparently innocuous motions before the General Synod calling for us to hold on to the theology of the Book of Common Prayer's views of marriage, because I think most people tend to think it's about this. And most people would actually say, probably, with possible question appropriate, well, the first 2, question mark, the third one, yes. So, but actually it's not just about that, it's also about this whole question of subordination. That is part of the theology of the Book of Common Prayer. And I think that leaves us with quite an interesting question in the Church of England, and in other parts of the Anglican Communion, which still holds the Book of Common Prayer, and has had a clue put it at our meeting. How can we express the theology of marriage? This is true both to the liturgical traditions of the Church of England and to modern perspectives on what marriage is and should be. I think that is part of what the ASB was trying to do, to hold on to a liturgy but to move it into a different understanding of marriage. And we do see in the ASB marriage is given that the husband and wife may comfort and help each other, so the mutual companionship being moved up here. It's given that they, in delight and tenderness, they may know each other in love, so a positive side of the control of lust here, so actually bodily union. And it's given us the foundation of family life, and I think that phrase was very carefully thought about in 1980 to acknowledge that not all couples are going to have children, but that you can still have a family life. Speaking as half of a childless couple myself, I found that a really helpful way of thinking about it. And I think that's also what common worship is trying to do, to move, to hold on to the tradition, the liturgical tradition, but to think again about what we mean. And in common worship as well, and in the ASB, I think we're seeing a much more egalitarian, equality-focused understanding of marriage.